Why Ibrahim Traoré released 1 million chickens into the wild. A shocking and expensive gamble to save Burkina Faso from locust and insect plagues and provide food for people and wildlife, and a desperate lever for the development of Burkina Faso's crop and livestock farming. When President Ibrahim Traoré announced that Burkina Faso would release 1 million chickens into the wild, the world was stunned. Even his closest advisors hesitated. Journalists scoffed, calling it an absurd experiment and a wasteful spectacle in a country that cannot afford mistakes. Critics whispered that the young captain-turned-president had finally overstepped, that his populist gestures were catching up with him. But Traoré, standing before a skeptical parliament, declared with conviction, "This is not chaos. This is strategy." Burkina Faso was facing a crisis. Swarms of desert locusts and outbreaks of crop-eating caterpillars were devastating fields of sorghum, millet, and maize. Entire harvests vanished overnight. Farmers who had worked for months watched helplessly as their grain turned to dust in a matter of hours. International aid organizations promised help, but their solutions were slow, bureaucratic, and dependent on expensive pesticides imported from Europe. Traoré knew that relying on chemical intervention would only deepen dependency and poison the fragile soil of the Sahel. He needed a solution that was African, natural, and scalable. His answer: chickens. Chickens are nature's most underestimated army. They eat locusts, caterpillars, beetles, and worms with insatiable appetite. A single chicken can consume hundreds of insects a day. Multiply that by 1 million. And you have a biological weapon against plagues that had terrorized farmers for centuries. But Traoré's plan was more than pest control. It was also food security. Every chicken is a soldier, he told his people, but also a provider. When the insects dwindled, those same chickens would reproduce, lay eggs, and provide a steady stream of protein for families. By freeing them into fields, forests, and villages, Traoré was turning a pest crisis into a food revolution. The costs were enormous. Procuring, breeding, and distributing 1 million birds strained the national budget. Logisticians had to coordinate drop points across provinces, ensuring that chickens were not concentrated in one area, but spread widely enough to maximize ecological coverage. Western commentators mocked the effort as wasting millions on poultry theatrics. But Traoré framed it differently. What is costly is hunger. What is costly is dependence on foreign pesticides. Chickens are an investment, not an expense. On the day of the release, villagers across Burkina Faso gathered in open fields as trucks unloaded crates of clucking birds. Children laughed as chickens scattered into the grasslands. Farmers looked on with cautious hope. International cameras captured the bizarre spectacle. A landlocked nation unleashing its feathered army against one of nature's oldest scourges. Behind the showmanship, however, was cold political calculation. Traoré understood optics. He knew that an image of chickens flooding the fields would travel farther than any policy document. It would capture imagination, spark debate, and reinforce his narrative that Burkina Faso would solve African problems with African creativity. It was a defiant gesture to the West, a refusal to bow to imported solutions that came with debt and dependency. For Traoré, the gamble was not about chickens alone. It was about sovereignty. It was about proving that even a poor nation, mocked for its weakness, could innovate boldly and on its own terms. If the plan failed, he risked humiliation. If it succeeded, he would be remembered as the man who turned chickens into a weapon of statecraft. And as the first weeks unfolded, the results began to speak for themselves. Locust swarms that had previously blackened the skies now broke apart as chickens devoured their advancing fronts. Farmers reported reduced damage in fields where the birds roamed freely. Meanwhile, local markets saw a surge of eggs, selling at lower prices than in years past. Protein intake improved, especially among children. And the countryside buzzed with a new kind of optimism. The world had doubted Traoré, but within weeks of releasing 1 million chickens, even his harshest critics began to ask, what if this gamble works? The release of 1 million chickens was never just about pest control, and Ibrahim Traoré knew it. He understood that in politics, perception is often as important as policy. The chickens became a living metaphor for his leadership. unconventional, grassroots and defiantly independent of Western models. Every feathered bird scratching in the soil was a reminder that Burkina Faso was rewriting the rules of governance and survival. What began as an ecological experiment quickly transformed into a political spectacle. Farmers who once complained of being forgotten by distant leaders suddenly felt seen. They spoke of the president not as an aloof figure in the capital, but as someone willing to gamble for their survival. Village elders told local radio stations, "No one has ever fought locusts with chickens. But if it is our chickens, it is our solution." This language of ownership was precisely what Traoré wanted. He had reframed the fight against hunger, not as charity delivered from outside, but as a national mission led from within. The move also re-energized the rural economy in unexpected ways. Poultry markets boomed as farmers began trading birds more actively. Families who had received chickens started breeding them, creating a cycle of production that generated new income streams. Instead of buying expensive pesticides, villagers invested in feed, co-ops, and simple veterinary care, all of which stimulated local commerce. Eggs became more abundant and affordable, reducing malnutrition among children and providing women with a steady product to sell in roadside stalls. The symbolism reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Regional neighbors battling their own locust outbreaks took notice. Delegations from Niger and Mali quietly sent observers to study how the program was working. What they found was remarkable. Pest damage in test zones had fallen by as much as 40% compared to control areas, and this without a single liter of imported pesticide. In the Sahel, where ecological challenges often demand cross-border cooperation, Traoré's chicken strategy was beginning to look like a regional export in its own right. But the brilliance of the plan lay in how Traoré manipulated the narrative. Western media outlets initially mocked the initiative with headlines like "Burkina Faso goes to the birds" or "Chickens against locusts, Africa's new folly." Yet instead of responding defensively, Traoré leaned into the ridicule. He gave interviews in which he smiled and said, "Yes, chickens are foolish, but sometimes the foolish win." This disarming rhetoric turned mockery into curiosity, and curiosity into respect. Before long, think tanks in Europe were publishing reports about avian biocontrol strategies, and universities were dispatching students to research the outcomes. What had begun as a joke was now a subject of serious academic discussion. Domestically, Traoré turned the chicken release into a tool of political consolidation. He made sure that distribution was carried out by local councils rather than centralized ministries, giving communities a sense of agency and reducing accusations of favoritism. He also mandated that 30% of the chickens go to women-led households, both to empower rural women and to showcase his administration's commitment to gender equity. These decisions bought him political capital in demographics, often marginalized by previous governments. The opposition, sensing the popularity of the program, struggled to find effective lines of attack. They tried to argue that the costs were unsustainable, that releasing chickens was a distraction from serious governance. But each time they raised these points, they were drowned out by testimonies from farmers whose fields had been saved, or mothers whose children now had eggs to eat daily. The chickens, in short, became politically untouchable. Internationally, the optics worked in Traoré's favor as well. By championing a homegrown solution, he positioned himself as part of a larger African Renaissance, rejecting neo-colonial dependency. At conferences, he framed the chicken initiative as a metaphor for multipolarity. The West brings chemicals, China brings machinery, but Africa brings life. We will not choose dependency, we will choose creativity. This line resonated across the continent, especially among younger Africans, eager to see their leaders break free from the binary trap of East versus West. The chickens thus became not just biological allies but diplomatic messengers. Yet beneath the symbolism there was hard strategy. Traoré used the momentum of the chicken program to push through wider agricultural reforms. He announced subsidies for poultry feed made from local grains, creating a feedback loop where crop farmers supplied poultry farmers, and poultry farmers in turn helped protect crops from pests. He expanded veterinary training programs to rural areas, professionalizing the care of animals and reducing losses to disease. He also leveraged Chinese and Brazilian expertise to design hybrid models of integrated pest management where chickens played a central role alongside modern technologies. This blending of traditional ecological knowledge with modern science was politically genius. It allowed Traoré to present himself as modern and progressive without appearing to abandon African roots. Economically, the returns were beginning to justify the gamble. Studies by the Ministry of Agriculture estimated that reduced crop losses had saved nearly $70 million worth of grain in the first year alone, more than offsetting the initial costs of breeding and distributing the birds. The surplus grain not only stabilized domestic food prices but also allowed Burkina Faso to increase exports to neighboring countries, improving its balance of trade. Suddenly, what had been mocked as a wasteful stunt was proving to be an economically rational policy. Traoré also used the chicken story to reposition Burkina Faso on the international stage. At the African Union Summit, he gave a speech in which he declared, "A nation that can defend itself against locusts with chickens can defend itself against poverty with courage." Delegates erupted in applause, not because they all believed in chickens, but because they recognized the deeper point: sovereignty comes from innovation, not imitation. By turning poultry into a weapon of political theater and statecraft, Traoré had done something few leaders manage. He had created a story powerful enough to redefine how his nation was perceived both internally and globally. Chickens were no longer just animals. They were symbols of defiance, resilience, and independence. And as the locusts retreated and the eggs multiplied, even his fiercest critics had to admit that Ibrahim Traoré had outmaneuvered them, once again, turning ridicule into reverence and risk into opportunity. As the months passed, Ibrahim Traoré's gamble with 1 million chickens began to outgrow the borders of Burkina Faso. What had initially seemed like an eccentric domestic initiative started attracting attention from African leaders who faced similar crises of pests, food insecurity, and ecological fragility. Delegations from Mali, Niger, Chad, and even Kenya arrived in Ouagadougou to study the outcomes firsthand. They walked the fields with local farmers, interviewed villagers, and counted the eggs in bustling markets. The results spoke louder than any diplomatic communique. Pest infestations had dropped significantly in zones where the chickens roamed, food prices had stabilized, and rural incomes were inching upward. Traoré understood that this was the perfect moment to scale his vision into a continental narrative. At the next African Union Agriculture Summit, he presented Burkina Faso's experiment not merely as a quirky national policy, but as a model of African ingenuity. He spoke in fiery tones, declaring, "For too long we have imported pesticides from Europe and America at costs we cannot sustain. For too long we have poisoned our soils and trapped ourselves in cycles of dependency. But Africa has its own solutions. Our chickens eat locusts better than chemicals ever could, and they feed our children while they defend our crops. This is sovereignty with wings." The hall erupted in applause. And suddenly the image of chickens as soldiers of food security spread across the continent. Traoré knew how to weaponize narrative as much as policy. International media once mocked him, but now they began calling him the poultry president or the captain of chickens, nicknames that he wore with pride because he understood their power. Every headline, whether written in jest or admiration, reinforced his image as a bold innovator unafraid to defy convention. But the deeper cunning lay in how he linked the chicken program to broader alliances. He began negotiating with BRICS partners to finance large-scale poultry feed production plants across Burkina Faso. China agreed to help construct processing facilities that could turn surplus chickens into exportable meat products, while Brazil provided expertise in poultry genetics to increase productivity. India contributed veterinary vaccines to keep the growing poultry population healthy. By aligning his feathered army with Global South cooperation, Traoré transformed an ecological gamble into a pillar of South-South trade. Western nations, sensing the symbolic danger, tried to dismiss the program as unsustainable. Reports from European think tanks warned that releasing chickens into the wild would lead to disease, outbreaks, or ecological imbalance. But Traoré countered by inviting scientists from African universities to conduct transparent studies. These studies revealed that chickens, when managed correctly, posed little ecological threat and in fact boosted biodiversity, by controlling insect populations naturally. He then presented these findings at international forums, embarrassing his critics and positioning Burkina Faso as a knowledge producer rather than a passive subject of Western expertise. Domestically, the chicken revolution opened doors to even larger reforms. The surplus eggs fed schoolchildren in government-sponsored nutrition programs, cutting malnutrition rates. Farmers began integrating chickens with crop cycles in an innovative system of agroecology. Fields were planted, chickens released to eat pests, manure left behind fertilized the soil, and harvest yields increased. What looked like chaos to outsiders was, in fact, a carefully designed cycle of regeneration. Traoré's government began branding this model as the Sahelian farm of the future, promoting it not just as a survival tactic, but as a template for sustainable agriculture in arid zones. The political returns were immense. By proving that a small, resource-strapped country could innovate where wealthier nations had failed, Traoré turned Burkina Faso into a beacon of defiance. Youth across Africa posted memes of chickens in military helmets captioned "Africa Fights Back." Farmers in Ethiopia and Sudan experimented with smaller-scale versions of the program. In Nigeria, parliamentarians debated whether adopting avian pest management might reduce the billions spent on chemical pesticides each year. Traoré watched with satisfaction as his country, once dismissed as marginal, became a reference point in continental debates. Beyond agriculture, the chickens became leverage in diplomacy. When negotiating with the European Union over trade concessions, Traoré invoked the poultry program as proof that Burkina Faso was no longer dependent on Western aid. "We feed ourselves now," he told European negotiators, "so if you wish to trade with us as equals." The sheer audacity of that statement, backed by visible results, shifted the tone of the conversation. No longer begging for assistance, Burkina Faso was demanding fair exchange. The chickens had become bargaining chips on the global stage. Traoré also used the momentum to push for African integration. He proposed an African poultry corridor, a cross-border initiative where chickens, feed and veterinary services could move freely between Sahelian states, combating pests and building shared food security. The plan resonated because it addressed both ecological and political needs. It was cheap, scalable, and symbolized African solidarity. Within months, ECOWAS ministers agreed to study its feasibility. If successful, it would be the first regional agricultural defense system led by an African idea, rather than imposed by outside donors. But Traoré's real genius was in how he tied the chicken program to his broader narrative of multipolarity. At the United Nations, he argued that Burkina Faso's strategy proved small nations could craft global innovations without Western tutelage. "We did not wait for IMF loans," he declared. "We did not wait for pesticides from France. We used our own birds. And with these birds we fed our people, protected our crops, and preserved our environment." That is what multipolarity looks like: many solutions, many paths, not one imposed doctrine. In doing so, he elevated the story of chickens into a parable of independence. What outsiders once derided as bizarre became an ideological weapon, a declaration that Africa could think differently and act decisively. And as global food insecurity worsened with climate change, the world began paying attention. Scholars wrote papers comparing Burkina Faso's chicken experiment with historic pest control strategies. Development agencies, embarrassed, tried to reframe the idea as innovative community-driven ecological practice, carefully avoiding mention of Traoré's name. But ordinary Africans knew where the idea came from. It came from a young captain who released 1 million chickens into the wild and dared the world to laugh. The laughter, he knew, would eventually turn into applause. Years after the first crates were opened and 1 million chickens flapped into the fields of Burkina Faso, the gamble that once drew laughter from international observers had transformed into a cornerstone of the nation's agricultural and political identity. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who risked ridicule and political capital, had reaped something far greater than pest control. He had created a living symbol of sovereignty, innovation, and African resilience. The immediate legacy was food security. By the third year of the program, Burkina Faso had cut its grain losses to pests by more than half, saving hundreds of millions of dollars in potential imports. Malnutrition rates among children dropped significantly, as eggs became a staple source of protein in school feeding programs. Local poultry industries flourished, with small-scale farmers breeding and selling chickens not only for consumption, but as pest management tools. The surplus created new export opportunities, with Burkina Faso beginning to sell poultry products to neighboring countries that once mocked the experiment. Chickens had moved from a desperate gamble to a national commodity. But the deeper legacy lay in how Traoré transformed that success into a political and diplomatic narrative. In speeches at the African Union, he framed the chicken program as proof that Africa could solve its problems without foreign dependency. "We turned our pests into food, our crisis into opportunity, our weakness into strength," he declared, reminding delegates that sovereignty is not given but created through bold choices. Leaders across the continent, inspired by Burkina Faso's results, began experimenting with similar ecological approaches, and within a decade, an African Biocontrol Alliance was born, focusing on natural pest management and sustainable farming. This alliance became one of the first Pan-African agricultural initiatives, led not by Western donors or multilateral banks, but by Africans themselves. Internationally, the million chickens became a diplomatic lever. When Western negotiators pressured Burkina Faso over trade or governance, Traoré reminded them that his nation was no longer begging for food aid. "We feed ourselves," he told them bluntly, "and we will trade on equal terms, not colonial ones." The chickens thus became bargaining chips, strengthening Burkina Faso's hand in discussions with both East and West. Global media, once mocking, began to romanticize the story, dubbing Traoré the man who saved his country with chickens. The narrative was powerful, because it carried both eccentricity and wisdom. A poor, landlocked nation had turned poultry into policy, resilience into reputation. But the true cunning of Traoré was how he linked the chicken legacy to the multipolar order he envisioned. He used the success to argue for broader South-South cooperation, securing Chinese investment in poultry feed plants, Brazilian expertise in genetics, Indian support in veterinary science, and Russian collaboration in grain storage. In each case, Burkina Faso extracted value without surrendering sovereignty, proving that a small state could maneuver in a world dominated by giants. The gamble also reshaped domestic politics. Opposition leaders, who once ridiculed the program, found themselves forced to adapt their platforms. No party could afford to attack the chicken legacy without alienating rural voters, whose livelihoods had improved. As a result, agricultural innovation became a bipartisan consensus, ensuring continuity of the strategy beyond Traoré's presidency. He had not just won a policy battle. He had shifted the political culture itself toward prioritizing food security and sovereignty. Yet perhaps the most profound consequence was psychological. For decades, Burkina Faso had been portrayed as fragile, poor, and dependent, a nation at the mercy of external actors. The million chickens shattered that narrative. Citizens began to see themselves as capable of defying odds, of innovating creatively, of inspiring others across the continent. Youth in Ouagadougou painted murals of chickens fighting locusts, turning the gamble into folklore. Musicians wrote songs about Traoré, Miss Birds, blending humor with pride. What began as a strategy became a national myth, and myths, as every politician knows, are stronger than policies. Critics still pointed to risks. Disease outbreaks occasionally swept through poultry populations, forcing veterinary campaigns. Ecological skeptics warned that chickens might disrupt certain insect populations. But these challenges were managed, and instead of undermining the program, they reinforced its adaptability. Traoré's government invested in veterinary schools, ecological monitoring, and rural extension services, turning potential weaknesses into opportunities for institutional growth. By the time Traoré addressed the United Nations, his message was global. Standing before the General Assembly, he declared, "We did not wait for the IMF, we did not wait for the World Bank, we did not wait for aid that never arrives. We used our own hands, our own birds, our own courage." This is the lesson of Burkina Faso: sovereignty is not a gift, it is built. Delegates, who once scoffed at the poultry experiment, now listened with respect, some even considering whether similar ecological approaches could be applied to their own crises. The gamble that began as a national spectacle had evolved into a global reference point in discussions on sustainable agriculture, food sovereignty, and multipolar governance. In the long view of history, the million chickens became more than pest controllers. They became ambassadors of an idea that even the smallest nations could reshape destiny with boldness and wit. Burkina Faso's fields stood greener, its markets fuller, its people prouder. And Ibrahim Traoré, the captain who once shocked the world by scattering birds into the Sahel, had secured his place as one of the most cunning strategists of Africa's new century.